Hey everyone, welcome to the Doctors of Running podcast, YouTube, where a group of doctors of physical therapy talk about the art and the science of the things that we and you are putting on your feet. Today, I am extremely excited to have Andrea Paulson from Saucony join me, and we're going to have a phenomenal conversation. I am so looking forward to this. So, Andrea, why don't you introduce us and tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll go from there.
Absolutely. It's so great to be here, Matt. Thanks so much for having me on. I'm Andrea Paulson, and I'm the Vice President of Product Engineering and Human Performance at Saucony. That is a mouthful of a title. So simply put, I lead two separate and unique functional divisions that might not seem like they have a lot to do with each other, but in actuality, I think they really work hand in hand in the product creation process. So product engineering, it's a catch-all division. So we'll work on everything from the technical CAD builds, so that's computer animated design, programs like Rhino and SolidWorks, management of all the molded parts, so midsoles, outsoles, plates, counters, and anything that needs to be cast or requires tooling. The design, building, manufacturing, and management of all lasts. So that's the shoe shape, the fit profile that every shoe that's made is built on. And then the bread and butter of what product engineering does is we handle most of the things that you'd probably consider advanced concepts or future technologies. So all the materials innovation and manufacturing innovation. And then on the flip side, human performance side is pretty much self-evident, right? It's probably much more familiar to you guys and your audience, but Saucony has a human performance lab, and we'll do all the mechanical, biomechanical, personal preference testing across all product. And that's where we separate the empirical and anecdotal data. Matt, I know how much you love your subjective data, but there's a fair amount of it that needs to be filtered between all the instrumented treadmills and VO2 maxes and stuff. But
I'm not judging at all.
I guess just to sort of wrap up, I guess the lab and engineering are what we call category agnostic functions. So we'll work on everything in all product silos. So we'll be working on a walking shoe outsole, a trail line midsole, a competition sprint spike, or like a marathon racing shoe. And sometimes we'll work on them sort of combination, all of them all at once. But it's also where all the cool and expensive toys live. So all the scanners and 3D printers and motion capture systems, et cetera. So that's sort of a wrap.
That's awesome. And we're going to talk about a couple of those, but yeah, I totally understand. And trying to merge those, trying to merge like the subjective component with the objective component can be so difficult sometimes, just because there's so much importance that goes into the subjective feel of a shoe. But then you also got to look at the objective stuff. And people like to get into camps of one or the other, but it's trying to marry that's the beauty, and that's the key, which is also incredibly difficult. But awesome that is one of the many amazing things that you do. So we are going to geek out on this episode because that's what we like doing. And so based on that, just a heads up, after we talk about some of the things that we're going to, what we want our listeners and our viewers to think about, our subjective question of the day is, when you're looking at running shoes, what measurements are you looking at? What's really important to you? Do you look at things like weight or drop, or you want to know width and things like that? What kind of measurements are you interested in, either that you do look for or you would like to look for? So that's our subjective question. Leave that in the comments below. We'd really, really appreciate that. So Andrea, let's start out with one of the big things, our big topic, and one of the really exciting things that we always talk about, stability. So we got to test the Saucony Tempus. You knew this was going to come up. It's like the first thing, right?
I did.
There's a lot of things that are evolving right now. When we talk about measurements, the way we either measure things or the way we quantify or the way we do things is changing quite a bit, right? So there's, the Saucony Tempus is one of a pinnacle of that. It's in my opinion, changing or really denoting a change in how we think about stability. So when you thought about stability, let's say a couple years ago versus stability now, how has that changed for you in your role? Super broad question.
Ooh, definitely. I think right off the bat, I think this is going to be the adjective episode.
Yeah.
I think there are going to be a lot of air quotes and
Yeah.
semantics
That's how it
around
goes.
how I
Yeah.
say things and how not to say things.
Yeah.
Because the minute the word stability gets thrown into a conversation, it's
Yeah.
like footwear people will either dive behind desks or like jump in front of a microphone.
Yeah.
It's such a hot topic, and a hot button. You guys have already spent a whole episode, right,
Yeah.
talking about what stability means
Right.
biomechanically. So I don't want to belabor those points, but
Yeah.
my perspective is more focused on materials. So the foams, the construction, and the geometry, and how those variables and specifics have a knock-on effect for the individual runner. It's less about the definition of the word stability, and it's more about the solution for the individual runner. I know that's vague. I know we talked about this before. Vague is just kind of how it's going to be, but go ahead, sorry.
I thought that was a beautiful definition. I like that. So, but we also deal in vagueness.
My boss,
so.
Totally.
Yeah.
My boss, so Saucony's head of product, is a guy named Brian Moore, and he likes to stay. His perspective is that stability has evolved. That these changes in foams and manufacturing and geometry made way for products, different products and approaches, and that take this word with a grain of salt, but like dinosaurs didn't just disappear; they actually evolved into birds. And I agree, and I think that these changes are probably here to stay, and we can get into those changes, but that these old forms of stability are going to stick around and should stick around, right? Like sharks in the ocean, if we're holding on to that metaphor. The Omni isn't going anywhere, and I don't think it should. We make running shoes and provide solutions for runners. Some runners are just always going to like that traditional guidance profile. So when we talk about the Tempus, it's a little bit different, but it's also just a new take on something that has already been out there for a while. I think you had a question. I think there's a slight delay, so I apologize.
No, that's okay. That's good. And I totally agree with you that oftentimes people will ask like, hey, does that mean things are going away? And I think the way of describing it is finding solution for runners and understanding that I think we're getting a better understanding of how individual people are and going, hey, this one specific method may not work for the population. That's one of the fun things that I can imagine you get to do, going, how can we figure out how to make this work for more people, right? Because we got to figure out this product. We don't want it to be, we may need to make something niche. That's fine. But the more people we can get it out to, the better. And so one of the things, this really goes in line with some of the stuff we've talked about this, and we always geek out on either Benno Nig stuff and some of the other stuff on habitual motion pathways and comfort filters. How have you, in a very broad sense, how have you utilized some of those thoughts, or has that changed a lot of what you've done recently? Or is that just going, hey, we kind of already do that? We always have.
Yeah, I think Matt Trudeau called Benno Nig the godfather of footwear research.
Yeah.
And I think that's a fair statement, right? Yeah. Like, I think some of his research is really at the foundation of how footwear brands build their products. So, and certainly how we test and validate them. So, you mentioned them, but Benno Nig's authored those two papers. And then basically they say, get out of the way, or don't interfere with the natural motion of a runner's kinetic chain. So specifically for the Tempus, there were a few different approaches, but the idea of, air quotes here, centering the foot onto the platform and not correcting anyone's gait was key. So we used a chassis of Power Run EVA around the outside templates of the midsole to gently guide, in quotations, your foot back toward the center line of your trajectory and over the core of Power Run PB. We also did this in the just released Exodus Ultra, which I think I saw somewhere behind you at some point. There it is. A frame that's the same thing, a framework of EVA around the guts of PBA foam. But I've heard this said a bunch, and I think it's a fair description of things. But this idea that you're in the shoe and not on the shoe. I apologize. I like metaphors, but the idea of like a canoe versus a racing shell, you feel much more stable in a canoe with like its high gunnel walls and its deep draft, but everybody knows you go faster in a carbon fiber rowing shell. So that's your first compromise. Do you want to be stable and safe, or do you want to go faster? And a canoe weighs a whole hell of a lot more than a shell. So with the Tempus, we were able to get the materials and the foam technologies to really do the job here. So we can give you those high gunnel walls and keep the structure super light. And the Tempus is what, sub 9 ounces?
It is. Yeah.
That's a really light shoe. That's a highly compliant, super responsive, low density foam that's in the Pro and the Speed without the traditional compromises that stability used to mean.
Right. And it's one of the first ones that we talked about before that's really, this is going to be an option. The Tempus is going to be an option for a lot of people, that may not work with some of the more aggressive shoes going, I want a marathon or half marathon or long distance racing shoe that I need just some guidance here, but I want that super foam. And it's nice to go, hey, because in the past, everybody's like, you got to make the shoes super firm for stability. That's the way it goes. But now talking about that idea of like getting somebody in the chassis and going, let's guide you forward is good to see going, hey, now people that might need this, that may not have been able to handle a less, more aggressive shoe, now they can enjoy some of the super foams. Although not sure if somebody gave me a hard time for calling them super foams the other day, but they really, in terms of performance wise, I don't remember why. Somebody called me out on YouTube and I was like, I think you could, these are pretty solid. I think they're pretty close to super, I think. In terms of some of the things that we're seeing. Be it durability
I totally think they're super foams.
Yeah, with like economy changes, even the durability is amazing to me. Is lasting this long, and everybody's heard me say this a million times. The Tempus is the only shoe recently that's lasted more than 200 miles with my mechanic. So that's amazing. I don't think any shoe in the last several years has done that. So. But it's cool that you can combine all these things and that we can start seeing, hey, how do we challenge not just the concept of stability for people that have stability needs, but maybe how do we get people moving in a more efficient way? And that's, I think, where people start forgetting about these combination of foams, plates, all this stuff is how do we get people's mechanics forwards, right? And be efficient. So, and we geeked out on all kinds of stuff when you were nice enough to invite us into Saucony. We had such a blast there. But obviously we had to geek out let's talk about these foams, right? So there's been some history of how these evolved, and the newest stuff seems to be these P-Bax foams. What was your journey kind of looking through where this stuff has come from and how it's evolved?
Loaded question. That is the question, right? If I was to do a brief history of foams in 5 minutes, and why it matters, first we had PU, and then we have EVA, and then we have TPU, and then we have PIBA, right? And honestly, I won't even talk about polyurethane. Like Saucony doesn't really use it, and while it has some good characteristics, there are some really hard knocks against it in regards to weight and responsiveness, and like poor hydrolysis, for example. Like it doesn't behave well when exposed to water, which can be a problem for running shoes. In a caveat here, right? Like everything I mentioned has exceptions. So this is a 30-second rundown, so the chemists out there can cut me some slack. But painting a picture, I think everybody knows EVA, or ethylene vinyl acetate. It's the incumbent material. I think everybody's familiar with it. I think their comfort levels are pretty high with the material, and I think the average runner might not know the exact chemical compound, but I think they recognize the name, and perhaps that it's been the standard for running shoes for, I would say, most of the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. But even EVA, so just talking about EVA, started changing dramatically 10 years ago. So there are these additives that can be blended into EVA to make them perform much better. So we can increase durability, we can make them less sensitive to temperature, and we can make them lighter, and we can make them more resilient or responsive, right? And here's where those semantics are going to come out again. Responsive is a stand-in word for like pop or bounce or rebound. It means everything, and yet at the same time is incredibly vague and means nothing. But back to the EVAs, there are these things called OBCs, or olefin block copolymers, that have radically changed EVA and blends and allowed them to become better performing and offer more compliancy. That's another word you'll probably hear a lot of. I know you guys spoke with Jeff Burns a while ago, and a lot of this stuff in a previous episode. But the idea that you can process these TPEs in a new way is really what started to change the game, because from those changes is what brought in those TPUs and those PBAs. And I sort of want to pause there actually and maybe ask you or kind of lead into the differences between the PBAs and TPUs, but it's almost more important how these materials are made and not just the types of materials. So just to downshift and come with me in a rabbit hole here, we have compression molding, we have injection molding, we have steam chest molding, which is really a culmination of extruding the material into a fine string and then chopping it into beads and then molding those beads. And now we have supercritical foaming, or SEF or SCP, supercritical process, and that's so very en vogue right now. Everybody wants to talk about SCPs. But I think a lot of people know that it's new and it's special, but maybe not why. And SCP foams are unique because of the blowing agent, and it's physical, not chemical. And it's also typically introduced in an autoclave, or you can call it a vacuum oven, with heat and bar. And what this allows for is like very uniform cellular structure inside the foam, because the gas is introduced at this like perfect glass transition temperature. And all that is a whole bunch of fancy words to mean that the cellular structure is super consistent, and it's combined with these newer, lighter, more bouncy resins, and it creates a midsole with incredible performance characteristics. But something I sort of need to back up and mention is that our Power MPB uses SCP beads. So as they're extruded, those beads are actually foamed in SCP. So we have incredible cellular consistency inside of the bead skin without any of those weight compromises. So that's not really a sales pitch for the material. That's just an added bit of science. But when you ask, okay, well, how did you end up with Power MPB and Power Run around it? It's a much longer conversation about the history of foam and then how we test those foams to figure out where best to use them. It's sort of a rundown.
No,
maybe.
That makes sense, and it's hopefully what helps the listeners understand is that, and the viewers, is that this is so much more complicated than just PU or EVA or TPU or PBA, because there's what you do with that material then totally changes that, right? So how you start messing with that material, where you put it, the geometry of the shoe, it's foam is important. But also what you do with it is really important. And the follow-up is trying to figure out how the body is going to respond when you actually put it underneath somebody's feet, which is the whole other interesting topic.
Yeah, and you guys do such a great job talking about that. There's no magic bullet. There's no silver bullet. You're not going to have one shoe be one thing to everybody. So you have to look at what works best for the runner and their personal use case. But yeah, going back to what you were saying about the foams and how we use them, I think an interesting segue might be to talk about how we test them. It's foam testing is not the sexy part of product creation. It's mechanical, it's analytical, it's really dry science. So we have, you guys were in the office and you saw, but we have a mechanical room with 2 Instron machines, and we'll do testing on one that's really more simple testing, like 3-point bend test. So you'll see the longitudinal stiffness between 2 stanchions, and you can measure the deflection of a midsole or a plate or something like that. But the real nitty gritty stuff is done on the other Instron, which is, it's an electromagnetically driven piston, and we use it to repeatedly whack. Yeah, we use it to just whack a piece of prototype foam or a shoe even. And the piston is a really sensitive piece of equipment, though. It's measuring the forces on the downstroke as well as the upstroke. So this isn't really IP. This isn't intellectual property, but the methodology is roughly this. So you have a piece of foam. It used to be 20 millimeters thick, because that was the average thickness, midsole thickness under the calcaneus, but obviously we need to consider higher thicknesses now
That
that
has really
Delta's Max
changed.
Cushion shoes.
Yeah.
And no kidding, right? Yep. But we take this foam and we apply pressures to simulate, say, a 170-pound runner going 830 pace, and the machine will spit out a stress strain curve, and we'll see how stiff the material is, its elastic modulus, so its resistance to deformity, and among other things, how much energy is absorbed and how much energy is returned. So energy return is the really exciting stuff. If you take nothing away from today's conversation but this, like, polymer science is incredible right now. We're seeing things I never thought possible. These new materials can return upwards of 90% of the energy put into them. That's insane. Your ears should be bleeding your brains. 6 to 8 years ago, a low 80s number would be really good. And we have a material that is 95% efficient, meaning it gives you back 95% of what you put into it. Now, obviously, that's the material score only, and it changes when you build a shoe around it.
Right.
But the laws of physics say you can't get to 100, and this is at a really low density. It weighs almost nothing, and you get back almost all that you put into it. It's incredible.
And so
we're at a precipice of.
So let's say 10, 15, 20 years ago, what were some of, like, say, some of were those EVA, or like some of the older foams, what were those giving back? Just for comparison.
Yeah, 10, 15, it probably wasn't too much. It wasn't too much lower, high 70s. You go back even further and it's going to be low 70s, maybe under 70.
Right.
So the idea that there are some dramatic changes in recent times is a lot of it is coming from this polymer science side of things.
Hence why
plates have been issues for a long time.
Right. So yeah, I always appreciate hearing this because we have a lot of people that comment going, it's all about the plate. We've already seen the research, right? The plates that we know tend to more stabilize the foams. Yeah. It's the foams that are the sexy part. And I just don't, it's one of those things, I think you and I both know this, but helping people understand just from the impact of having a 20% increase in energy return is mind blowing. Going from, that 70% ish to now being in the 90s and having tons of things out there that are in the 90s. And even that those small percentages getting up 90 to 95% is nuts. It's just, So the foams are incredible and what people are doing with them and experimenting. Yeah. You were saying?
Yeah, no, I'm totally in agreement with you. And plates are a piece of the puzzle, like you said. It's an important part, but read some of Wouter Hucommer's papers, and you can see that plates are at times not doing as much as everybody thinks that they are.
Right.
And the idea that these incremental, well, it's not really incremental, they're exponential improvements in these foams. We can correlate them, much like the 100 grams equals 1% in human energy efficiency. Yeah. We can correlate that about 5% of energy efficiency in a foam and in a shoe equates to about 1% of energy efficiency for the human. I should say oxygen uptake. This is a good conversation for Corey, our biomechanist, because I think the language that people use around energy efficiency and RER and oxygen uptake is very confusing. So that's it's making sure that everybody's on the same conversation points there is important. Yep. But here's an interesting thing for you, Matt. These materials are really compliant. They're really soft. They're incredibly squishy springs. But if when you load a spring, right, it compresses and then it releases. But foams have some viscoelastic response. So meaning there's dwell involved. So an extreme example would be like the memory foam mattress. Right. If you press your hand into it, you take your hand away, it'll slowly rebound, backfill. These foams all do that as well, but on like a millisecond level. So I'll be a little guarded here, but like we look at how these foams react to how you toggle those initial inputs. So if, say, it's a 100-pound runner instead of a 170-pound runner, or a 420 pace instead of an 830 pace, what changes? Now, I'm not suggesting we approach product design that way or consumer sales that way, but what if we did? What's going on there?
I like where you're going. So correct me if I'm wrong. What it seems like is asking questions like, how much is each runner compressing this? And I think we talked about this as going, who's going to get more from this? And how is that shoe going to respond? Who might get more energy return depending on the weight of the runner, how much force they're putting into the ground, how much they're going to compress the foams. If somebody's super light on their feet, are they going to get that same energy return from somebody who slams into the ground? And then the follow-up question is, how long is that energy return going to last? Because we do know all foams tend to compress and you start losing some of that resiliency. And you be careful with that word, meaning how much does it bounce back?
Right.
And so that's a big question is how, again, going back to what we talked about earlier, what you so amazingly said, like trying to figure out how to best serve the needs of the runner with people that are so different. That's really hard, right? Because people are going to, that's the other part of the equation is going, you're creating this foam and shoe, but how is each person going to respond to that shoe? And that's challenging, exactly. Right? Because then somebody that's 100 pounds versus somebody that's say 200 pounds, even if they had the same gait mechanics, there's going to be very different forces going through the shoe. And how does that affect performance? So that goes into my question. Go for it.
No. Please, you were on a roll. I was just saying but gait is never the same.
No.
So you have people with different gaits. You have heel strikers, forefoot strikers, larger runners, smaller riders, quicker cadences, slower cadences, longer ground contact time. It just continues.
Right.
So I'm sure you had a good question.
Yeah, sorry. No, that was, and it's even more on that is all of those things are going to vary based on muscle timing, based on biomechanics and all these things. And for the listeners and viewers out there, for those that don't know this, your gait is more unique than your fingerprint. It is that specific to each person that people are so different with how they move. Over however many years you've been around on this planet, that you are going to pick up something totally different from somebody else. And that's what I really love. A lot of the students in different like movement professions, the students are progressing well when they can tell their classmates based on their gait. I'm like, okay, good, you're getting that. This is good. But yeah, my question goes into how do you, this is super broad, how do you account for that? What do you, when you're designing a shoe, how do you account for that? Or is that something you got to go, hey, we just got to see what the average consumer is versus the elite? Is there is this a super broad question that can't be answered in like a 5-minute conversation? Or is there's some principles?
Kind of.
Yeah.
No, kind of. It sort of goes back, and again, this is a super vague answer.
Yeah.
So I
it was a really vague
but,
question. So to be fair.
We have to make shoes to suit a lot of different running styles and gaits and needs. So what we will try and do is make product that will behave differently for different runners, subsets. And I know that's vague, but the intent is to have different. That's why a pro and a speed exist. I think that's probably the best realization of what you're asking. Is they're very similar, especially in terms of the material and the stance and everything else, but they're also very different because of the plate and the different templates. The templates are obviously the difference between the 1 and 2. Pro and Speed 1 and 2 versus the Pro and Speed 3 are a little different. We've worked to maybe pull them apart a little bit further. It's exactly why we did it, because not everybody is going to love a stiffer forefoot that the Pro gives you, but they still want the same material and they still want the same benefits. So what happens if we put it in a different plate? Well, let's find out what happens if a larger runner runs in one versus the other. There's no. I think a common misconception is that the faster runner needs the Pro. That's a common misconception. I think it has to do with how you're landing, what your gait is, and all the rest. I know I've heard you you gentlemen say a number of times. So
you got to think about
won't beat that horse, but
just to remind everybody, is this again, and this is some of the stuff that came out of McLeod, and it was through Saucony, which is awesome. Which is like, yes, somebody's putting out research. It's that different people respond to different geometries and different plate stiffnesses. Not everybody needs the stiffest thing. If you give somebody that their mechanics are not lining up with that plate, a shoe that's super stiff, it's actually going to decrease their economy. It may cause some issues, right? Because you're creating a bend point where somebody may not have a joint. And if you're trying to bend something that doesn't have a joint, that's going to create problems. If something's too stiff, it's going to be like getting over a board instead of facilitating their mechanics. So some people are going to work really well with something like the Pro, where it's stiffer, it's very snappy, whereas somebody else is going to have the same, if not better, performance in something like the Speed. And it's not that one shoe is better than the other one. It's again going, how are we best serving the needs of this unique individual and what their mechanics match with?
Yeah. Yep. And bringing it back to the Tempus, I think a lot of people, I read blogs just as much as everybody else does and listen to shoe reviews, etc. But the idea that something has to have a plate to be a certain speed as well is a misnomer. And one of the things with the Power Run chassis that goes around the Tempus is that it's what's a post? It's just the difference in hardness between two materials. They can be soft materials, but so you have this centering chassis, and as it comes down into the forefoot, it drops down along the bottom of the template and then back up, and like you get these ski tip effect. And people might not believe me, and that's fine, but you'd be surprised what a little bit of EVA and the cement that's necessary to hold those things together will do for you in terms of creating a speed roll and that rocker effect. And again, it's not a plate, and it's not, people might not believe me here either, but this isn't a replacement for the Hurricane. I think a lot of people are like, oh, this is the new Hurricane. It's like, well, it's not a mutually exclusive answer here, but really it's a different way of looking at the speed. And how do you take something with these super foams, and I'll use the term, it's a super foam, and introduce some gentle stability into it. One other thing, you're going to love this. Stack heights. So not to throw shade at anyone in particular, but I hear it all the time, and I read it as well. People will say, I won't try X shoe because it has Y heel to toe offset. It's like, that's just a premature statement. It's these new foams, they're so compliant, and there's no way for someone to tell if an offset will work for them without trying the shoe on first. Offsets don't mean what they used to, and you have to consider the offset under load. I always call it, we call it our effective offset. I've heard you call it dynamic offset. Whatever the semantics, these new foams put us into a new ballpark. It's a different conversation.
And I think that goes really nicely to the thing where we were talking about, hey, what measurements do you look at when you're looking at shoes? And you got to realize that these vary. Definitely when it comes to heel toe offset, that a very soft foam, especially with some of these, and I think we can call them super foams. If they're getting into the 95% energy return, I think I feel very defended now, and I appreciate being validated going, yes, we can call this that cool. But you have to realize a lot of the mechanics are going to change. And if you depending on where you land, depending on how hard you're landing, that's not going to stay the same throughout your gait cycle. And so people need to realize some of these measurements are going to depend on a couple things. And people don't like when we say this, but the best thing you can do is get it on your foot. And that's when you know if it's going to work for you. And some people, and part of our website, part of, I think everybody's goal is to help people understand what's going to work for them as an individual. And that sometimes takes time, but you can't beat putting the shoe on to figure out if it's going to work for you. So we can, and I say this as somebody who has a website, right? And so wants to try to help people with that. And there's so much you can read. And if you have an experience, you might be able to figure that out. But you got to get the shoe on your foot, I think. What do you think?
Well, I'm a nihilist at heart, It's I kid, but honestly, when it comes to innovation, it's with these foams and foam innovation. I think we're still at the infancy of of these developments in foams and polymer science. So this problem isn't going away. Problem. It's not a problem,
Right.
but this conversation isn't going to go away. People in innovation, there are these graphs. It's a growth and trajectory graph, and it's basically on the X is time, and on the Y is, we'll call it advancement. Yeah, and it shows these series of like repeating S curves, and at each meteoric jump, it comes to its peak and it sort of plateaus to level, or sometimes it even sort of like dips down and downward, and that little blip is called the trough of despair, or the trough of disillusionment. I think that's a bit melodramatic, but the process has been proven time and time again that I think we're still coming out of that trough and on the upswing in terms of these materials. So going back to saying I'm a nihilist, I'm not. I think you have to be a natural skeptic and a cynic to work in innovation. If you're not, you're doing it wrong, right? So you have to explore all the points and counterpoints and challenge gospel, because innovation is challenge and innovation is discord. So this idea that you can't, that you don't, this idea that you would cross a shoe off of your list before you have it on your foot is, it's null hypothesis. Prove that it works for you. Prove that it doesn't work for you. There's so much that products can offer you. You have to get them on your foot and you have to try them. You have to look at it as the products and brand teams in innovation look at it, which is prove to me it doesn't work, and then I'll make my decision. Which is sort of a scientific approach to looking at it, but I'm saying the same thing as you. Get it on your foot.
Yeah, get it. But I like the scientific approach. It's funny that you say that. Like, what you called it, the Valley of Despair. Is that even worse? What was it called again?
The trough of despair.
The trough of despair. That's more doable than the Valley of Despair. It's much lighter. I feel like that same, it's funny that kind of same pathway is very similar for usually clinical growth of a lot of people if you're continuing to move upward. And the funny part is where innovation tends to go that way. A lot of times with clinicians, they'll go through this bell curve of where when people start a lot of times, and this is, I think, any profession where they usually start out and like, I know everything, I'm great. And then as they keep going, they just like, I don't know anything. I am an idiot. I don't even know why I do this. And then you slowly start coming out of it and you're like, okay, I'm more aware of what I don't know, and I actually know how to work with that, and I respect it. And then you start coming out the other end like, I'm not a total idiot, but at least I'm more aware of what happened over here. It keeps doing this, right? And that's, you have to keep challenging your biases and challenging assumptions, and that's how you grow. And that's innovation or growth, and I think it's the same thing. And that's what's really cool, is to hear you say, hey, we've just had this crazy explosion in the last couple of years, and then to say, yeah, we are just at like the beginning of this, is really, really cool to hear, right? Because we're already seeing stuff that blows my mind every day. Like if you told me this
every day
10 years, oh my gosh, it's been 10 years, 10, 12 years ago when I was working in running stores, I'm going to have to process that for a second. That like, if you show, when I was like just learning running shoes and all that kind of stuff, those many, many years ago, and if you showed me some of the things now, my brain would have exploded. I would have not had known what to do or how to process this at all. And just now it's just normal.
Same.
It's just like,
it really is. It's impressive. I've been with Saucony almost 19 years. Same thing. If you had asked me back then, we are now bringing back shoes that I worked on originally. That's nothing like that to make you feel a little long in tooth, but it's we bring them back as originals, as our casual line, and I remember those original blueprints. Yeah. Let's look at those materials. Oh gosh, they were so heavy. Oh my, why did we do that? Like, just slap a Varus wedge in it and call it a day, or hey, more shank, more TPU.
Right.
And the idea of, and we tested things back then too, but the idea of how we validate and prove that things work, it's a new conversation, and Yeah.
It's a continual conversation. I think that in everyone's defense, right? When even 19, 20 years ago, you're doing the best with all the information that you have, and that's what you have to keep challenging, going. Right? And someday, I'm sure we'll look at Peebo foams and going, is this, maybe it is, maybe I'm wrong, but is this the best?
Right.
What have we learned in terms of how the body's responding to it? What are these long-term effects of these foam? We don't know that stuff yet. We have no idea.
No.
So I'm sure we'll look back.
And
yeah,
that's a really important part, because I think a lot of people maybe expect us to be further along with that research, and that research is so hard to conduct. And it sounds like such a cop-out, but to run those clinical studies and to run those, to filter that information is just so very difficult that you're right. And these might, I have to be careful how I say that.
Yeah.
Right. Who knows what
Who knows?
the long-term effects of some of these materials will be. I don't think that they're the best materials that we'll come up with. To your point, is Peebo going to be the holy grail? No, I don't know that we can get much higher than 95% efficient. I mean, it's just, again, laws of physics. It's going to be hard, but maybe you can continue getting lighter, in terms of your the specific gravity of materials. Like they weigh next to nothing, and then what? How do you build that? That's the problem too. Is there are amazing materials, but how do you manufacture them?
Right.
It's part of the reason why PIBA based materials and TPU based materials sort of blipped, hit a trough of despair, and then picked back up, because it took a minute for us being the footwear industry to figure out how to mold and control and consistently get runners product that feels good and behaves the way we want it to. So it's really interesting. Again, it's so cool, the things that we can put on people's feet these days. I know I told you a story in the office, and I can't tell it here, but there are just amazing things happening in the world of polymer science.
Yeah, I'm very excited. There's a lot of things I know we can't talk about here that I got to see, and I was like just geeking out. I was like, if my eyes open any wider, they're gonna pop out of my skull. So let me just put these back here. I was like, it's one of those things, like, and we were so honored to get to go and see this, and anytime we get to be part of this, just the complexity of what goes into a shoe is astronomical. It's not just something that you put on your feet, although some people might feel like that. So much goes into this in terms of there's been years and years and years of development into how do we get this foam to actually, we have this material, how do we mold it or make it work for what we intended to do? How do we get this to roll and move with different mechanics? And it's kind of like almost like having a child, right? Like you got it, like it comes out and you're like, this is not ready to go out in the real world. And it takes a long time. Like even I don't know if a lot of the listeners and viewers realize how long it takes a shoe to get to market.
Yeah, and it's getting longer.
Yeah.
We're heading in the wrong direction in a lot of ways. And it's really hard as product people too. You have the Pro and the Speed 3 behind you. It's like, that shoe is not out yet. How is that shoe not out yet? We wrapped that shoe 8 months ago, 9 months ago, now 10 months ago. It used to be a 12 to 14 month process. Now it's getting above 16 months in some cases, because we have to commercialize everything and then supply, hashtag supply stream. It's not a fun thing to talk about most of the time, but to your point, it's a lot, and when it finally hits the stores, it's really interesting. Being in a product team is really cool. It's getting to see something come to fruition, but it's also really challenging because you are just now seeing the Pro 3 and Speed 3 and the Tempus and the Exodus Ultra, and we've wrapped those projects a long time ago. And guess what? We're working on the Pro 4 now, and things of that nature. And we're going into it somewhat blind. We're hoping that you guys like the Tempus and that it succeeds, and that we've done our due diligence on testing and making sure that all of the product testing along the way is validating that we have created exactly what we wanted to create and that it's positive feedback. But it's very hard at times to run headfirst at a wall that might or might not be there. It's one of those like wipeout games. There
Right.
might be something behind that door. We don't know.
So that's interesting that you are like, and we know this, but just for the listener viewers, that a lot of times you're starting work on the next product line, or even sometimes even the second or even third product line, and the other one hasn't even hit the market yet. So you're almost going, how can we predict how this is going to go? So we have a prediction, and you also need to watch what actually happens while you're down the line, right? It's like doing like 8 things at once, just trying to go, we hope this works. Yeah. We've got, obviously, it's not hope, right? It's that you put so much work into this that you've been able to test it. You have wear testers. There's all this stuff, feedback that you get as well. But that's an interesting challenge. It's like you're designing the next study while the other one still like hasn't even started yet. Not that I can judge. I'm literally doing that in the PhD program I'm in right now. So I
don't doubt it. Yeah.
It's at a very different level and probably equally stressful in different ways. But yeah, I understand, and that's hard. It's like, oh my gosh, how's this going to go? Because there's so many components that goes to material science, how people are responding to it, how the masses respond to it, and that's, gosh, it must be always on your toes. So clearly you're a forefoot runner.
Definitely. You got to keep your head on a swivel. I have a 21-year-old ACL replacement, so it can legally drink. So I run on my forefoot and on one leg and my heel on the other, because most people are heel runners.
Yeah, it's okay.
I'm all right with it.
The people don't get upset. Did you know that one of the Runner's World articles I published called "It's Okay to Be a Heel Striker"? I got like 8 or 9 people from different levels. I had 2 people that were like plant PhDs that were screaming at me. It was like all caps. I'm like, did you really send this entire email in all caps? People were so upset. I'm like, it's okay. It doesn't make you less of a person if you land on your heel. It's okay. Calm down.
No, it does not.
Calm down.
We're lucky. We sponsored Jared Ward, and he's a solid heel striker, and we love to use him for all sorts of research because of that. As many people will claim that they're forefoot strikers or midfoot strikers, most of them are not, and it's okay to be a heel striker. And don't worry, we test for both situations.
And for those wondering, there's actually research on the ability of human beings to tell how their foot lands, and it's garbage. We are really bad at that.
Yeah.
And
which paper is it that shows that when even if you start running barefoot, you eventually will transition to heel running? Is that part of your paper? I think it was. I can't remember.
Yeah, I don't remember who. I know who you're talking about, but it comes to doing, it's efficiency, right? Just landing up front, it's a lot more in terms of those calf muscles, which will eventually fatigue, and it's not a mechanical issue. It's your body going, this is really, I need to switch to something else, and that's fine. We know as the distance increases of these events of like running, that the longer you get, the more likely you are to be a heel striker, just because it is more efficient versus when you get shorter, right? You shouldn't be sprinting on your heel. That's not efficient for that. But you also maybe shouldn't be sprinting when you're trying to run 100 mile. So it's like, it's a tool, right? It's just different. It doesn't make it bad. It's just, you got to figure out, is that going to work for you? And then you have people like Kenny Sipakele, who is supposedly a forefoot runner, but if you watch him run cross country, he switches to whatever he needs. It's like, maybe it's a tool. Maybe you should learn to utilize a varied amount of movement strategies. And just nerding out from the neurologic world is that we've actually found that people that tend to have the least risk of falls, and especially as you get older, are the people that have the most variability in movement strategies. Like, they can kind of do whatever they need to, and they can get around it. Whereas the people that tend to have more issues are the people that use the same pattern over and over again, which may make, if you're a runner, right, running 100 miles, maybe that is good. You just need to use the same thing. But others, again, what are the needs of the runner? I'm just going to start geeking out, because that's
Absolutely.
literally what I'm writing on at the moment for the dissertation is masters runners and gait variability. So don't let me keep going.
I love it. You were telling me about that. It was,
Yeah.
it sounds like really fascinating research, actually.
I'm super excited because we're all getting older. I'm trying to figure out what is happening. How do I keep running? How do we keep running? I love, by the way, I'm going to steal that because I have a patient who also has I think they made a similar comment where their ACL is also 21 years old. And I didn't think, hey, it can legally drink. I'm going to use that, but I will cite you because that is gold.
That's fair. Thank you.
Now, going back to some of these foams. So, and you alluded to this going, hey, you've got, say, a 170-pound runner versus a 100-pound runner. And that's going to compress these foams very differently. But how are some of these newer foams doing in terms of compression durability? In terms of how long are they holding on to that resiliency?
It depends. It depends on a lot of different things. Sort of the rundown I gave you at the very beginning. It depends on what the material is.
Right.
It depends on how the material is formed and molded. Like I was saying about bead foams, you have the cellular structure inside the skin of a bead.
Right.
So the cellular walls also have, it's almost like putting balloons inside of a balloon, without the compromise of weight. So that's the same density as other materials, but they're encapsulated. And that extra skin around the bubbles can help really extend the life and durability. And not by durability, I mean compression set durability, repeated impacts, versus something that might not have a bead foam. Now, that's not to say that every bead foam is going to be the best in terms of durability. It is just an example of how that cellular interaction is helping and benefiting the material. A lot of it does come down to the material type. TPUs are just more resilient. Again, there's that word than some of the other materials like an EVA, like a flat EVA. But again, most EVAs are not just EVA anymore. No, I can't think of any ones who would be. So it's here's the interesting thing. Everybody has access to the same stuff. And in my mind, I can hear my team being like, "Oh, don't talk about that." But everybody has access to the same resin suppliers, right? So the BASFs, the Dows, the DuPonts, the Arkimas, whoever it may be. And this is so true in the cycling world too. So what? Okay, so we all have access to the same sort of root resins. A Michelin star chef can walk into a grocery store and use the same ingredients that I do, but trust me, you're going to want to eat that meal. And that is why all of this polymer science is so interesting. It's because this is literally a cooking show, right? Like they made a cooking show out of this. So everybody has access to these materials, and what you can create with them is really special and really unique. And that's going to be the key to, I really hope that people enjoy running in Saucony product, because we spend a lot of time working on what goes into Saucony midsoles and midsole foams and the geometries and the templates and how they are all built, because it's just a piece of the presentation and part of the meal, but it's really comes down to the polymer science and the manufacturing behind all of it. And I don't know how much I can repeat that for all of your viewers, is that you've got to get it on your feet and you have to try it, because they're all going to be so different. They're all going to be so unique to a specific need and function.
And that's, again, we always appreciate that going, everybody is unique. How everybody's going to respond to these shoes is going to be unique. And that's what obviously frustrates people, because people always want to know what's the best shoe. It's like, no. You can't ask that. It's like asking what's the best meal. It's going to depend on who made it, who's eating it, what their preferences are. And I think shoes are exactly the same way. But the meal, the recipes are getting a little crazy in terms of like maybe it's just me living it, kind of remembering where my brain started in the footwear world and going, this is nuts. And then going, this is probably going to be in 10 more years. This is going to be, this was basic stuff now. It's like, what?
Yeah, I mean, getting back to, you had mentioned it before in terms of timelines.
Yeah.
The material that I mentioned that is 95% efficient, that shoe hasn't come out yet. Like that's we're just waiting for that to get into market.
Yeah.
And it's oftentimes it's a race to get things into market because you want to be first, but there's also a race to get things right and validate and all the rest. So it is an arms race, and I know it's been called that plenty of times.
Yes.
But what we as a product team do is try and make the best stuff for all the different types of reading. The runners, I'm sort of repeating myself here, but it's I think the shoes behind you on the rack are a perfect example of that.
I'm so sorry. Wouldn't it be technically a foot race or feet race?
Oh,
I'm so sorry.
I apologize on behalf of all.
Yeah, I'm sorry. This is what people have to deal with.
Hear that, everyone.
Yeah. This is what they should, if they're listening, they should know this is coming.
It would be a foot race.
It is an arms race, just from like almost like weaponized, essentially. If you think about it, just the way, especially with some of the advertising stuff like that, it's just, it really has become. And some people have even talked about some of the stuff with, the footwear companies, people foregoing sponsorships and stuff like that. But I think what's cool is you're starting to see the playing field level, and that's why we haven't gotten ready to read this. But I love this shoe so very much.
Excellent.
It's been really awesome. And
That's
it's
awesome.
really upsetting that I have to go, and I've gotten enough miles on it. It's ready for review. And I'm actually really sad because I don't really want to review other things right now. So I've really enjoyed this, but this is what's cool, is to watch something that was like, I really enjoyed the Endorphin Pro 1, and just to watch just that explosive leap from, upper was doing really, really well on version 2. And then this explosive leap into version 3 with, you're still using what feels like the same material, but just you've changed geometry. You've changed so much that really changed the ride of it to this very fun yet very aggressive shoe that it's very hard to take off. Not literally, the upper is super.
That's always our goal.
Yeah, the upper is super comfortable. It's not hard. It's because I don't want to take it off. That should
not
clarify.
Difficult. Yeah, I gotcha.
I got it. I really like.
I mean that.
Yeah. Go for it.
That is our goal.
Yeah.
If I could have any like pin in the map or feather in my cap, it would be, here's a shoe. I want you to not want to take it off.
Yep.
So that's awesome. That's good news for our product team.
It's so different than years ago. I feel like, shoes, you ran in them as much as you had them on for the run, and you got them off as soon as you could afterwards, because they just were not super comfortable. They did what they needed to, but I feel like it's improved. Like, that's why, for me now, I still understand why people have sandals, but I'm like, if the shoe's comfortable enough for you, why would you be needing to take it off and walk around in a sandal afterwards? Like, that's footwear comfort's really important, but that's, I'm a nerd and read all the research on measuring footwear comfort and what that means. So that's just me, but it's such a huge component. But it's like,
it is, but I know we always come back to this sort of thing in this conversation, but going back to laws of physics, right? The energy you're putting into your shoe is still going into your shoe. Mm-hmm. So people are feeling better in these new fleets of product, right? But what's happening?
Yep.
It's a really interesting thought, right? And I know you particularly will look into this sort of stuff, but that energy has to go somewhere.
It does.
And it's going back into your body. It's going back into your body somehow. Where's it going? And we need to help. Part of our process is trying to figure that out as well. So
that's appreciated, because I feel like a lot of times, especially like other products, I think don't always look at what are the, we're trying to make this stuff for consumers, but then also ask the question, what is this doing to the consumer in terms of, this is not an unsafe product, obviously, but then asking, like, it's a tool, right? And tools need to be utilized for certain things and may or may not work for different people. And that's part of the education that I really appreciate that we talked about, is going, hey, when should you use this? When may be the best time? And then there may other times it may not be appropriate. How do you figure that out? And that's a challenge that, again, people ask these questions, but we haven't, I know that you've seen some of it, but just having a really large data set, we just don't have this on the larger population in terms of what happens when you put them in a super bouncy foam versus a super firm foam. We don't know what happens long term. Do people start getting the hypothesis would be if you put people in a stiffer foam, or a softer foam, that they would start to stiffen their mechanics up. But we don't know. We have no idea. So that's the fun part about, there's still so much to explore. Although I'd love to explore that. But when I was talking to Malazzo off air, when I was like, hey, I'm doing this PhD program, and he just stops and goes, don't do that for your PhD. You can do that afterwards. But if you want to finish it, do that afterwards. And I'm like,
I know.
Just,
when you told me that, I couldn't believe it.
Yeah.
At first, it's like, wait, why? That's a great idea.
Yeah.
Oh, I understand. Yeah. All right. Well, we want you to graduate.
Yes, I would like to graduate and not be eaten alive repeatedly by my advisors going, there's all these variables that we don't understand because we're not footwear people, but we're still going to chew you out alive. And it's like, yes, so work on that. But yeah, I feel like that's the fun part. And I feel like that's where, to me, a shoe like the Tempus is really exemplifying, asking, how do we make this work for so many different people? And how do we problem solve? How did I already forget the term? My brain, I'm losing it. How do we solve a unique problem for each runner? Right? In terms of what's the specific to them, exactly. What do they need, and how can we try to encompass them while several others? And again, that's where I think that concept, especially when it comes to wrapping back up to stability, of going, how do we help guide people forward? Because at the end of the day, that's what running is, well, it's supposed to be, unless you're falling over, is running should be a bit going for, right? I mean, sometimes trail running.
Fair point.
What was it? Somebody was telling me the other day, it was one of the masters runners I was working with. And he goes, yeah, I thought it was normal to fall every time I went for a trail run. And I'm like, no, no.
Matt, I went for a trail jog, on Monday of last week.
Yeah.
And, I pride myself on being a, ex-athlete, and I caught my toe on.
You're still an athlete.
I caught my toe on a route. I'm an aging athlete. I caught my toe on a route and completely yard sailed on the trail. And there was like 20 yards left on the trail run. But I was wearing this bright green shirt, and it had just rained, and I was just covered in mud, and I had to do this walk of shame back out to my car. It happens to us all.
It happens to everyone. It's happened to both my wife and I. My wife, who's the professional trail athlete, where I've seen her eat the ground.
Yeah.
And then I'm like, oh, look at that. And then I'm not looking. And while I'm like I don't make fun of her, but I'm like, look at that. Aren't you professional? And then I, of course, hit the ground because I'm not paying attention. Especially those last couple meters where you're not paying attention. I can't judge.
I'm tired, just wanting to get out.
Yeah, exactly. I have a couple.
Yeah. I wish I could blame the footwear, right? No. But, user error.
Yeah. I have a couple old scars on my knees from some fun falls. My wife actually has the same thing. She has one that's worse, where she fell so bad she opened up her knee and had to go to the emergency room, and that gets sewn back. And this is before I met her. But trail running is not for the faint of heart. You got to be ready for anything, and that includes falling. But you should not be falling every couple of steps. That's it. But anyway, tangent. But the goal again with footwear is helping people get forward, helping them. Whether it's performance, whether it's enjoyment, right? And everybody's going to have something different they're looking for. And I think that's, again, where you're getting back to going, there's so much that goes into this. You cannot assume that just because it says a certain material that it's going to perform a certain way. It's really important to make sure that, you can read reviews like the ones we put out, or, at the end of the day, you got to be able to look and test this stuff. Because even when you're talking about, I remember you mentioned, hey, just there's no plate in here, but remember the purpose of plates is to stiffen the sole. There's lots of other ways to do that. So just because it doesn't have a plate can't mean it's a racing shoe for somebody, or it can't be a training shoe. It just depends on the person, and asking, what do you as an individual need? And people have heard me say this before. It's not what your neighbor needs. It's not what your running partner or your running enemy or your rival is. What do you need? And that's the fun part, is these products now are becoming diversified enough that I think there is a solution or something for everyone. It just takes a little experimenting to figure out what that is. And that's the fun of this continuing to evolve. and going, all right, I need to also evolve with it. Whether you're a product developer going, how do we continue to innovate and create? Whether you're a runner going, how do I keep figuring out what's working for me in this changing landscape of footwear? And then for clinicians going, how do we keep up knowing how this is affecting people? And how can we help? For us, it's the fun of trying to go, how can we have a fun time trying to see if we can bridge the gap in terms of mechanics and rehab and stuff like that. But it's fun. And if it was the same, it would be boring and people would not last in this. But it's always changing, and that's what makes it fun.
No, I like the word you use there, diversification, and I think that's a perfect wrap on it. Yeah.
Well, that's great. Oh, Andrea, thank you so much for coming on. It's always a huge pleasure and a blessing to have you and get to talk with you. Any last words of things that you think people should be aware of in this big changing landscape of footwear? Anything people should, like a one sentence thing of what people should pay attention to, or what people should be looking forward to? Maybe the more fun thing.
Oh, looking forward to. That's great.
Yeah.
I think you have to be open to try things. And I encourage you to obviously try our product, but try on anything and everything and see what works for you. Because, I think you at Doctors of Running specifically, thank you for having me, but you guys are, I should say you folks, because I know you have a couple others outside of just the three that I normally see. You guys are, I just did it again. You folks are doing things differently, and not all product review content is created equal. And what I really appreciate is the perspective and approach that you have in looking at product. And I think that's my advice, is take your advice. We listen to what you have to say as well. And then that's try things on, try product, and, be exploratory with it, because there's a lot out there that product can offer you. And I think in order to really truly experience it, you have to get it on your foot.
I think those are excellent words of wisdom that I think you and I have said probably 40 times during this episode, but that's okay. It must clearly be important if we're both saying that. But Andrea, thank you so much for coming on. And again, for all of those listening or viewing, there's lots of different ways to watch us and follow along with what we're doing. We're going to have a lot of Saucony stuff coming out, and we are super excited for that. But again, check us out. We're on a variety of different platforms. We're obviously on Spotify, we're on YouTube, we've got Instagram, we've got Facebook. As always, I got to give a shout out to Bach, who would like people to know that he has a wonderful LinkedIn that he's working on for us that has exploded recently. And there's all kinds of content we're putting out, even especially on the website, which we've got all these new guides, and we're trying to do the same thing, diversify out. We've got this new walking guide that we've got out, the stability guide for people that want that. It's a place where we want people to be able to learn. So please follow us. Again, like, subscribe, whatever you're going to do, leave a comment. We always appreciate it. And we hope this stuff is helpful, because it's fun getting to try all this stuff and then hopefully teach and be able to share what we're learning so that each person can also learn about what works best for them.